Hello, everyone. Brother Al McClain with this week's stewardship video. And as always, before we go too far, let's read the disclaimer. No advice should be seen as a recommendation or an endorsement. And I'm not a licensed financial advisor, and this is for educational purposes only. So you want to do your own research or utilize if you have a financial advisor or registered investment advisor, that's what they're there for. And this video is inspired by the passing, really the life of Sally R. Moore, Sister Sally. I had the privilege of serving with her at my church, St. John, on the executive leadership. And we did a celebration of life for her this past Friday, April 25th. And Sally Moore was a tremendous civic leader, educator, a principal later at Dalworth Elementary School, and that was later renamed in her honor the Sally R. Moore College and Career Preparatory. And you know, you got to be a bad individual to have a school named after you. And I had the privilege of serving with Sally Moore, as I said, on the executive leadership. And I will tell you, paramount in her life was education. In fact, when I was reading her obituary, one of the things that talked about, she often reflected on how education was a cornerstone in her upbringing and a pathway to success. And her proudest accomplishments included establishing honors programs, creating support for at-risk students, and aligning curriculum with state standards, all while emphasizing the nurturing role of teachers in shaping good citizens. And I'll also tell you, she was a devout Christian and member of our church. And Sally would probably have been upset with me because the day of her funeral, there was a Charles Schwab workshop. It's a 2-day workshop. It was Friday and Saturday. In fact, I'm making this video right after the Saturday session. I did not go to the Friday session, and Sister Sally would have told me, Brother Al, don't worry about me and my funeral. You need to go get that education, get that wisdom. And so, with that, that's inspiring me for this particular stewardship video. And I thought about some of the best wisdom is to stay teachable and seek wise counsel. And the wisest counsel, and you'll see later in the slide, is God's word. So Proverbs 9:9 says, instruct the wise and they will still be wiser still. Teach the righteous and they will add to their learning. Philippians 4:12, here's an example of God's wisdom in which Paul learned. He said, I have learned the secret of being content and in any and every situation. And Titus 3:14 says, learn to do what is good in order to provide for urgent needs and not live unproductive lives. So that's an example of being teachable and seeking wise counsel. And the wisest counsel is embracing God's wisdom. First Timothy 6:10 says, for the love of money is the root of all kinds of evil. That's wisdom from the word. Matthew 6:20 says, but store up for yourselves treasures in heaven, right? Hebrews 13:5 says, keep your lives free from the love of money and be content with what you have. And finally, Matthew 6:24, no one can serve two masters. You cannot serve both God and money. That's all what Sister Sally Moore would have said. That's the ultimate wisdom. That's the ultimate counsel, which is God's wisdom and God's word. So that's the backdrop of this particular stewardship via education. And with that, I mentioned to you, Sister Sally Moore probably would have been upset with me and saying, Brother Al, you should have went to that Friday session. It was a 2-day session, but I did not. I felt it important to honor her legacy in life. But I did make the second day, which is here's a picture of the Charles Schwab workshop. And I've mentioned to you before, the great thing about it, you can go out on Charles Schwab um, website and see these events. And here's the great thing, they're free, right? There's no, you don't even have to be a client or have a Charles Schwab brokerage account. They're free and they feed us a continental breakfast and we had lunch. Parking was free, the whole thing. And it was an entire day. In this case, we talked about stock options and futures. The day before, it went over advanced option strategies. You can go out and look for something in your area. In fact, there's one coming up in Houston that's not till to December. And I have done this before where I've traveled to Houston, stayed overnight, and participated in the workshop. So I encourage you again. This is wisdom. This is counsel in the area of finances. And so one of the things I want to change gears, and then I'm going to come back to an idea that came out of this workshop. So always be looking for counsel and wisdom. But just to take a look at this week, tremendous amount of earnings that are being reported this week. This will most likely move the market. But I've been listening to a couple of other people that are saying the market hasn't been blinking on the last couple of weeks of earnings. It's been more news based, a tweet away from the market going up or down, a tariff tweet away from the market going up or down, which is interesting. But I don't know if the market will move, but typically with these type of companies that are reporting, it would move. Visa is huge, right? UPS, huge company. Coca-Cola, Pfizer, right? Caterpillar, Microsoft, Meta, Lilly, Amazon. These are huge companies that are reporting. Shell, right? Typically, it would move the market. I don't know now if it will or not, because right now it's all about not necessarily the earnings of the company, but what's their forward forecast of what they see coming. Are they doing layoffs? All of that's news driven. So this is next week. So here's the thing that I wanted to point out. I was in this class in a group called a CME, right? Chicago Mercantile Exchange, which they focus on futures. They're an exchange, futures exchange. And he put up this slide and it talked about options are among the fastest growing products among retail traders at the CME. So this is options on futures, right? And if you don't know what futures are or options are, definitely look at a YouTube video. I'm not saying you trade it, but here's an idea though. Look at this. Look at the growth in these areas year over year. And I'm saying this is one of the biggest things. And I thought about it. CME, guess what? That's a publicly traded company. And here's going out on stock analysis, put in the stock symbol CME. Then you can look real quick as what do they do if you're interested in knowing what they do. Again, do your own research. I'm not making this recommendation, but this is just a way of spurring an idea, right? Here's an idea, right? CME is not going to be subject to tariffs, but yet, let me show you something here. Look at this dip that happened. This is when they announced, quote, Liberation Day. Look how it dipped. Well, CME has nothing to do with tariffs. They're not exposed to tariffs. There's nothing that will affect them. So they dropped, but it did recover. That might have been an opportunity to go in and buy some shares, right? Look for something like that in future. If there's some other tariff news and it takes a dip, right? But look at overall how that stock has just been turning and burning. And why? Because there are people highly active in the futures and options market. So they're making their fees off of that. So when the market goes up or down, it's still trading for them, right? It's still fees involved. Here's the other thing. If you can't afford, it was like $268 a share under stock slices on Schwab. CME is one of the offerings. So if you've got as little as $5, you could go and get exposure to CME. Same thing with SIBO. SIBO is the options equivalent. This is Chicago Board of Options Exchange, Chicago Board Options Exchange, right? Look at that. Same thing. Look at that huge dip. They're not exposed or to tariffs. Tariffs are not going to do. They don't have a product per se that goes overseas, right? There's no tariffs on their products, right? There's an opportunity there. Same thing. CBOE, if you can't afford the $213 a share, is a little bit cheaper to CME, right? You can do the same thing. Stock slices for as minimum as $5. Okay. And so I wanted to just throw this in because um, the CME sponsors this tool. that I've used before. And one of the tools that they have out there is the probability. May 7th is the Federal Reserve meeting. It looks like it's going to be a non-issue because typically that moves the market. But May 7th, according to this, right now, the current rate fans funds rate is between 425 and 450 basis points. There's an 89.6% chance, according to this, stays the same, right? And Chairman Powell has been saying, I'm not moving rates, even though President Trump has been saying, you need to decrease. He's been insulting him. I may consider firing. Well, by law, he can't do that. But Chairman Powell is basically saying, hey, you want interest rates to go down, you need to decrease tariffs, right? So let's take a look at the overall market as we close out, and I'm going to show you something else related. So we always point out QQQ, right? That's the exchange traded fund that has the exposure to NASDAQ. Look at that. Oh man, like a cliff. Woo, right? And then this big red was that Liberation Day. Slightly recovered, not totally recovered to the records we are, but we can see we're going back into there's a bull uptrend happening in there, but overall it's still a downtrend, right? So think about this. QQQ is the market, but NASDAQ is what it covers. There's a company publicly traded called NASDAQ that could be an interesting way to play this as an idea. And it's $75.36 a share. And again, tariffs should not affect us, but it dropped, right? All the way down. It'd have been great, off of its high, $83, it dropped down to 66. Now it hasn't fully recovered. It's at 75, may still be a bargain from its high of 83. Again, this, you have the ability through stock slices to buy it. And then the last one, S&P 500. Now, most of that is on the New York Stock Exchange. All right. And this is the S&P 5, SPY we always look at. Well, the New York Stock Exchange is owned by a group called ICE, the Intercontinental Exchange. Look at that. It fell off. Again, tariffs have nothing to do with this. All right. So is there a possibility you spend $163, $63.23 to have a share, or again, found it on Stock Slice? ICE is out there. So if you've got as little as $5, but I will say the best is to have at least full shares. But the next best thing, if you can, if you don't know how to do options or anything like that, because that's another way of doing it, is to expose yourself with stock slices. Or I think Cash App offers their ability to buy stock. Of course, Robinhood, Webull, there's other. Find an app that you're comfortable with to participate in this. Again, these are not recommendations, but just designed to give you an idea. All right. Do your own research. With that, that's this week's stewardship video. So I want to take it all the way back to Sally Moore, in that her life was an example of education and wisdom being paramount, and educate yourself. Hopefully, the stewardship video acts as just one of the components to do that for you. So, as always, remember, God's wisdom is the best wisdom. Therefore, 1 Corinthians 4:2 says, to a manager who's put in charge, the need to be faithful. And what does that mean? Being obedient to God's word. But before we can be obedient, right, we want to know God's word. We want to spend time in God's word. We're still meditating on his word. And with that, as we always say, Jesus is Lord. Therefore, he's the owner, but we are that faithful steward following his directions and his principles. We'll see you next week.